There it is. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Clark Art Talks. I am Kendra Larson, and I am the Archer Gallery Director and Clark Art Talks Coordinator. Today, we are lucky to have Chris Lael Larson here to do a talk. Um, Chris is a Portland-based artist. He has shown work in over 30 cities across the U.S., with notable exhibitions at the Berkeley Museum of Art, Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, and the Portland Art Museum, Northwest Film Center. In 2020, he received a grant from the Regional Arts and Culture Council to publish Cape Disappointment, a photo book that documents the visual vernacular of the distinctive towns of the coastal Northwest, places where historical, cultural, commercial, and natural forces layer to create a confounding visual melange. Chris is a member of Carnation Contemporary and Wave Contemporary in Portland, Oregon. Chris received a BS in Earth Science and a BA in Photography from the University of California at Santa Cruz, where he was awarded the Irwin Scholarship for the Visual Arts. So please help me welcome Chris Lael Larson to Clark.
Gotcha. Um, Happy to be here. Happy to chat with y'all. I will share my screen. Okay, let me know if you cannot see it. Yeah, I'm Chris. This is me. I kind of love that this in progress image is actually the same image that's in your background, Kendra. How the worlds collide. Yeah, so let's dive in. I kind of always love to set context by talking about like what I call my previous life, which I was actually just mentioning briefly. Before getting into focusing on visual art, I was very focused on playing music in a very like experimental context, mostly mixing live instrumentation, electronics with projected visuals. Here's some imagery from that time. I was always trying to decide whether I was going to focus on music and art, and I kind of worked into this modality where I was combining both. So writing songs, um, and then figuring out like how they're going to be performed, and then kind of creating these bespoke synced visuals that would go with the performance. So I did this for many years and was really ended up being the kind of entry point that got me into visual art. I was mentioning to Kendra earlier, Damien Gilly, who's also at Clark, was someone who came to one of these early shows, saw what I was doing with the projections and actually really invited me to, I don't know, get into the visual art world and specifically show at his gallery at the time. And it was something I'd never really considered, being so focused on music and touring and performing live and that sort of thing. But then ultimately what happened is after a while, I was just getting a little bit burnt out on touring and playing live and kind of like that existence of, I don't know, there's just a lot of physical labor, there's a lot of late nights, there's a lot of travel. And so backed away from doing that, and kind of wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And kind of along the way, when I was playing music, was always, would get invited to do these art things here and there. They always just felt like these little like fun one-offs. So then after I quit music, I was living in a warehouse at the time, and there was a large kind of vacant studio space that could be used by anyone. And so I started doing a lot of like early explorations that were very like purely photography based. And a lot of them had, subtle concepts. Humor was a big part of it, kind of just like playing around with different ideas. I'll share a few examples here. This first one, which I call Flora Packaged Goods, was just like all about the fact that I probably knew more about like branding than I did about like species of birds and or flowers. And so I did these series of still lifes where I'm like matching plant life to consumer goods, packaged goods, specifically like cheap mass-produced things. And so I was started doing like a lot of like self-initiated projects here that really kind of existed halfway between just like a playful experimental visual context, somewhat in an art context, somewhat in like a, they definitely were referencing like studio photography, commercial photography in their, visual approach, how they were rendered. At this time, I was working at a graphic design, so I was also spending a lot of time art directing photo shoots. So to me, it was kind of like also a way to kind of take that visual language and subvert it and put it into a new context. Um, I did a lot of projects like this that were these explorations. Here's another one where it was just kind of taking like the I don't know, the seriousness of sport and kind of like toyifying it. Finding these massive, kind of almost like human-sized, building out these sets that were using like objects that just like took sport and kind of like made it silly, reminded us that it's a game, not to take it so seriously. And a lot of these, like at the time, I really wasn't, showing them, sharing them maybe here and there on social media, but really it was just like me kind of really exploring and just trying to find what my new outlet was going to be, or what the new, I don't know, voice would be. So I felt like I was, kind of defined myself as a musician for the longest time. And then after switching away from that, trying to figure out like what's the new voice, what's the new modality. So I just did a lot of exploration, also started doing a lot of uh what I would call like experimental fashion photography or fashion adjacent, a lot of times in service of like other bands or other musicians. This is an electronic band that was in the Northwest that moved to the East Coast, but would work with them a lot to kind of create these like collaborative imagery that would kind of augment what they were doing as musicians, building off the themes they were thinking about. And these were very collaborative in terms of just like how we came up with concepts, how we executed them, how they came to life. Um, and so it worked kind of in and out of this modality for, I would say, like 5 years. I just had this free photo space that was just like very easy at the end of any day or any weekend for just to go in there, invite friends over, try out new ideas, explore things, kind of develop my craft as like a photographer with regards to like lighting approach, technique, and kind of all the technical skills. And then also started getting into like mark making, especially during the pandemic. There was a phase where I couldn't get in there, so I started to paint and draw. And then when we came out of the pandemic, I started bringing in painting and drawing into image making, sort of like merging those two things together. And really just like enjoyed like the world it unlocked and the potential it unlocked, but also just like the process became so much funner too. Like I've always loved the process of photography, both out in the world, but also studio photography. So a chance to kind of blend that um, with blend mark making and painting and drawing into photography, just like it just made it the process all that much more like joyous and fun and exciting. Which led to a project where I first started to kind of really, I would say, like develop the voice and the style of what I do today. I think there's a lot of, I don't know, sometimes I make this a simplified sort of binary where I feel like there's a lot of artists who come out more fully formed, who just like out of the gate have their thing. I'm definitely someone who like took a lot of experimentation and trying out things and failing and experimenting to kind of like land on the thing that I feel like I do. And so I'd say like this is maybe the first project that landed in that realm. It's the name of this project is Still Life with Discarded Paintings. I kind of like naming things in very just like dead simple language. So what was happening in my studio at the time was I was just collecting randomly a lot of these paintings that I'd find on the streets, or find wherever, that just like I really loved. And most of them, an example is what you see on the left side of your screen there. Most of them are just like very rudimentary, oftentimes beginner paintings, oftentimes paintings that were like considered like a failure, like someone tried the thing. It was like an early attempt. And I just liked having them around. And I realized in retrospect that a big part of what I loved about them was just like the simplicity, the rawness, the openness, the kind of innocence that went into them. But then also that they were discarded, that like someone considered it a failure or didn't like it enough to like hold on to it. But for a long time, I just like really loved having them around. And then what I started doing is like building still lifes out of them, and oftentimes like these large scale still lifes. So this is kind of a process example where I would take the painting you see on the right. I would build out a large kind of temporary installation, which you see in the center, myself in there for scale. And then the resulting image would be on the right-hand side. And so essentially taking this like discarded impulse, kind of continuing it, but like continuing it, beyond just painting. So it's taking the painting, continuing the painting, but then also bringing in actual physical elements, depth, real elements that are kind of continuing the visual language or the visual impulse of it. And also being someone who's not very technical or trained in painting, like I was kind of also continuing paintings that like, I'm the beginner in this case. But I love this idea of taking something, recontextualizing it, that like anything could be a seed for a new creation. This is another kind of smaller example, the original painting, discarded painting on the left-hand side, and then the kind of new composition that expanded out of it on the right-hand side. So even things like in the picture on the left, there's like a rock that's painted into the painting. And so on the right-hand side, I was actually taking real three-dimensional rocks and then painting them to look like the rocks were painted in the painting. So there's also just like a sense of like subtle humor in here. Again, here the painting on the left, and then the kind of expanded painting, so-called, on the right-hand side. I also really love that I was like taking a painting and converting it into something else that like felt like a painting, was usually in the language of painting, but it was actually presented photographically or captured or created photographically. There's a huge part of me that like loves the language of painting, but then also loves the visual language of photography, how it creates depth, how it creates shadow, texturing, contouring. So from a very just like purely formal sense, I really loved how those two could come together. And then some of these compositions would get more and more complex, where the kind of original source painting becomes, so hidden and obscured. So really continued on this for a while, just kind of trying out all different things in terms of, the style would shift, of course, according to the painting I found. So there was also an interesting approach to just like broadening up the sort of things I was encountering, using different techniques to kind of create depth, to change what like the picture plane could be. And what was interesting too is when I'd show these work, because the end result is a photograph. 9 times out of 10, people would assume what they're looking at was a painting, which I thought was very interesting and kind of a fun tension that I like to play with too. If you're looking at a photograph, but most of what's in the photograph has been painted or treated, is it actually a painting at that time? Like, since that's how you're reading it, since that's the visual language you're interpreting. And then things get kind of just like bigger and bigger and kind of more in depth. And so when I'm making something like this in the studio, it's about 4 by 6 feet at least. So it's pretty human sized, but started to mix in more materiality, more depth, kind of more layering. And was just like, as soon as I started this body of work, it just felt like, oh, this is starting to feel like something in terms of just like developing a visual language that just felt like really unique to the things that I was interested in, the ideas I was thinking about, specifically around like the hybridized forms. And I realized like hybridized forms are also something that I've been very interested in, even looking back to what I was doing in music. It wasn't sitting in music or it wasn't sitting in film. It was kind of in this weird space between those. Oftentimes we would perform at dance venues or at experimental art venues, but then also in electronic venues or rock venues. And so I think that's always been a through line to anything I've done. So I think I'm always interested in, how different media blend in unusual ways. Some more and more get complex. And I think it's also worth calling out that these are all just shot in camera. Like nothing you're seeing here is being created in Photoshop or layered, in After Effects. These are all, built by hand, like all the depth you're seeing. And the layering is just all actual things that are built out in studio. These two are also human size. I would say like the set used to create these is maybe 6 wide by 8 feet tall. So large, up on ladders, these sorts of things that kind of build out these visuals. As a continuation of that, I started looking at like, oh, isn't it interesting? A lot of the paintings I was getting were these like abandoned landscape paintings, which I thought was like a really interesting concept as well. Because obviously there's a lot of I don't know, the disuse of the landscape in general is maybe like the light and friendly way to put it. And so I thought there was something interesting conceptually about landscape paintings, but then the failed paintings that are kind of like thrown away. And so I'd be finding these landscape paintings that I would rebuild into these photographic compositions. And it was really a nice way to just like also use just different materialities, different visual approaches, different like compositional approaches. This parlayed into a series after it, which I called Beginner Nudes, which is very similar, but instead of taking just like general landscape and or abstract paintings, my source material are these what I call beginner nude paintings. So oftentimes these were from students in the early kind of intro to painting classes when you're learning the figure for the first time. Um, and I think same thing here. I was just like really drawn to these images because of the innocence of them. I kind of love that the proportions are all off. The perspective is, not quite right. There's just like this looseness to it. But of course, it being the body, the figure, there's also all these other layers of kind of just like meaning and connotation. This idea about like, innocence and nudity kind of have this interesting, two sides of the same coin in a way. And I was actually able to work with painting teachers at the college level who are able to give me these paintings. What was interesting is like they laughed when I asked if they had any like discarded paintings from their figure nude classes because they're like, oh yeah, all the students make these and they hate them. And so we have piles and piles, so as many as you need. So I think I collected quite a few. And so then the process was very, very similar. I would take these paintings and then I would build them into these large scale temporary installations. So here on the left, you can kind of see two of the paintings, for example. And if you look closely on the right-hand side, the big construction and building, you can see how they build in. And of course, this case, them being nudes, I'm bringing in a lot of fabrics, a lot of branches, things that are about clothing, things that are about like covering up bodies. It definitely plays into these concepts of the original sin of like Eden, this whole like Edenic notion of like innocence, like is the naked body a good thing, a bad thing? And then of course like branches and trees and natural elements that were themselves also like denuded in a way. There's no leaves, they're very bare. But then it's also bringing flowers. And I think what I love too is like whereas the series before was blurring the line between photography and painting, this is very much blurring the line between photography and painting, and now kind of installation and assemblage, creating these, I don't know, like these, yeah, temporary installations essentially that just had this like depth and detail. And so you see the paintings on the left, the kind of assemblage on the right. And this is kind of shows that process too, where I start from essentially just this blank canvas, um, print out imagery, start to paint the imagery into the surface, build it out into a large installation, and then create the final image, which you see on the right-hand side. Um, and so then that last piece, so on the right-hand side, it's 20 by 30, and it's presented as a photograph. But again, what was interesting here is every time I would show these, it was so fascinating how many people actually would read this and connect to this like as a painting, which I kind of really love. Like I love that it exists in this, I don't know, this indeterminate space between like, is it a painting? Is it a photograph? Is it a record of a sculpture? I mean, maybe the answer is yes, it's all those things, which is something that I kind of like loved about this modality. Here's another one from the series. Beginner nudes again, left-hand side, you can kind of see the scale of the build up and the installation, and then on the right-hand side is the resultant image. And again, from a formal quality too, I love the fact that like the shadows you're seeing in the image on the right are actually like real shadows that are captured photographically. There's a type of depth and sort of like lighting that you can only get through studio photography. Well, not only, of course, you can recreate anything with painting. But there are some of those formal qualities I love from my early photography work that, made their way into this like visual language. Another one from the series. I think what I also really loved about this approach, this way of working, is just like how depth was created, like that illusion, especially when you put something in a frame, kind of like the visual illusion it creates of like, am I looking at something that actually has real layers in it, or are they kind of implied layers? Another image from this series. To kind of like an experimental project, there was as many people in Portland may know, the Lloyd Center Mall um, is a mall that, like many, has kind of been declining over years in terms of just like how busy it is. There's very few kind of stores left, so there's a lot of experimental spaces where people are trying things. And for a while, there was a place there called Family Photo Studio that was exactly what it sounds like, but they also did a lot of art shows. And I became friendly with one of the people who was running it, and they'd asked if I was interested in doing an installation there. And Initially, I really wasn't sure how that would look because I'm also someone who just like does not like malls, does not like kind of, I don't know, sterilized shopping environments. But I thought that could be a really interesting tension to play with, especially in a mall that was, falling apart, decrepit, closed down. There's so many storefronts in there that are completely vacant, but also in like degrees of disrepair. So many of them, if you've been in there, you've probably seen it. There it looks like the tenants moved in great haste, and oftentimes there's just like remnants of, what they did in the past, left behind. And so what I started to doing is just taking a lot of photographs of the space, um, focusing in particular on just like these weird things that were left behind, these things where like it kind of reads as maybe this was a space that was a retail space or something related to commerce, but it's really kind of indeterminate. And I thought that was like really interesting and fun thing to play with. And so the approach here was really, instead of like my previous projects where I'm working from found, or I should say discarded and found paintings, in this case, I'm working from my own photography. So the first phase of this project was to kind of just do a lot of photography of the mall. Um, so this is a lot of those photographs. I spent probably a good full weekend. I think it's worth noting too that in the process of photographing them all, since I was like bringing in like flash lighting and those sorts of things, I was actually kicked out of the mall twice during the process of making this project, which I kind of got a kick out of because it brought me back to like, I don't know, early punk rock or skateboarding days where like that was just part and parcel of your existence is you're doing your thing you do in the world and people are very confused by it. Some more of those images. So tons and tons of images, which I kind of like in their own right for, there's formal qualities, not only with the light, but the cropping, kind of the abstraction of these elements that are very, very standard, but kind of taken out of context, especially when they're in a vacant, decrepit mall, become very interesting. And I think maybe in a previous lifetime, like I would have been excited about this imagery, like in and of itself. There's huge schools of photography that are like focused on this sort of thing, which I really also love. But what I started to do is kind of take those images and then started composing paintings over them. And I realized it kind of started just happening like organically. But it was this kind of symbolic way of like breathing like life and texture and new meaning and shape and kind of expression into these like decrepit things. And they were like really quick and like gestural, and kind of ways to like process like dealing with the subject matter that I just like didn't like. It was very sad and kind of depressing. And so these are larger scale. A lot of these are like 30 by 40. Just like I would make these big kind of cheap paper photographic prints and then do these paintings on them. And then what I ended up doing is like taking those paintings and then a lot of kind of old abandoned building material, and I would kind of blend them all into these large installations. So again, this is kind of installation view. This is the scale of this is about, I'd say like 6 by 9 feet. Taking these large paintings, but bringing them in together with like wood, clamps, building materials, plastics, fiberglass, a lot of like detritus that was like from the building sites, and then created this body of work around those where I'm doing a very similar approach, but basically taking all this like old source material and old building material and kind of rebuilding it and reconfiguring it into these new compositions. Again, playing with that tension between like, is it a photograph? Is it an installation? Is it painting? It's kind of all three. Um, and playing with that like sense of depth and confusion and like, what am I looking at? What is it? What isn't it? How do I engage with this? I think a lot of those tensions are something that I really kind of enjoyed exploring. A lot of them got more and more busy. And again, I think worth calling out, like, there's no Photoshop here. Everything you're seeing is just like built practically and photographed just in the studio as like a single kind of dimensional unit. Um, Love just playing with like that maximalism, just like trying to translate how it really felt to be in those spaces and deal with, I don't know, you're just immersing yourself and focusing your lens on what is ultimately like very sad. It's just like a lot of broken dreams, this just vacant kind of hollowed out world. And then what I did ultimately was just kind of like take all this material and bring it back into the mall. Um, I thought it was just like a really fun thing to just like sample them all visually, just kind of go to my studio, like create and generate, and then kind of like bring it back into. But also taking those pieces and just like allowing myself to like remix and recontextualize them and like make a wholly new kind of like explosion, like this big colorful mess of a melange within the space. Um, what was really fun too is this was all during, of course, open like mall business hours, so people are coming in. Of course, there's, in theory, yes, you could like buy pieces of the installation, but this is like not commerce. This is something that's like using pieces of commerce and feeding them back on themselves, but like ultimately not a thing that is like purchasable. So it was a fun context to do an installation like this, where it's, taking this place and like breathing new life and color into it. Which brings me up to my kind of most recent body of work, which is called Cascades, which started all at the Cascade Head Natural Preserve out on the Oregon coast, which is also the location of Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, which is probably a well-known place where a lot of artists will go, but then also a lot of ecologists. So what I wanted to do is like kind of evolve the practice and, again, work from my own capturing of a landscape, but then like build it into the process. So started just photographing, like creating tons and tons and tons, hundreds and hundreds of images all over this region. Things that were just like anything that just like felt like it was like part of the texture of what made this place this place. From the plants, the wildlife, to like the landscape as a whole, to the geomorphology, how it all came together. So this is kind of some views of just like how thorough it is. I could, spend 20 minutes with these like three firms, just kind of like understanding how they work, how they operate, how they're, part of this ecological system. And then process-wise, what I would do is essentially print these photos out large, but I would also do a solarization process with them that would kind of shift them and give them this kind of more ethereal quality. I would start pasting them up together to make these like new kind of landscapes, these new compositions. And then I would start combining them together using paints to kind of make this wholly new composition out of these little pieces that I was like really drawn to. Slowly adding more and more paint and context, really like pushing the colors. I really love this concept of like with painting is like not painting how something looks, but painting how something feels. And I really use that as kind of like this North Star to lead this process, taking these things and pushing them into these kind of more like experimental or like Faubus color spaces. Um, and then ultimately, the last step of it was I would start to bring in elements that actually encountered in those landscapes within the image. And so I love the way that this feeds back on itself. So it's not only images of the place, but it's also then actual pieces of the place that come in. And then I would bring in some dimensional elements that would give the image even more kind of like natural depth. And again, the scale of what you're seeing is the set I'm building out in the studio. This is probably about 4x6. So like roughly human size, and working at that size does from photography perspective allows you to just like put a lot of detail and put a lot of, it's kind of world building in terms of how you're creating these images. So on the left-hand side, you can kind of see the scale of just like the areas working and how these are coming together. But then on the right-hand side, what the final image looks like. And again, very much this blend of like the photography, but with painting and assemblage, like bringing in the actual elements within the image. And it was kind of nice too that they had this like fleeting quality, like essentially just had enough space where you make one at a time, and then to make the next one, you essentially have to like destroy the one you just made. So I thought there's something that's just really interesting and compelling about like the temporality of it, like these fleeting moments that I was capturing in the photographic process are also like fleeting in the studio. They're only there for a short amount of time, and then they're kind of captured as this image, and then you move on to make the next one. Here's some detail shots that show kind of like how some natural elements were interspersed, which I feel like was the kind of like funnest, most, I don't know, exciting part of it was just like how you or not only like bringing these elements in photographically, but bringing them in real. And I just kind of also love that the meta quality of how you're creating this feedback loop of like you start with this images, this source material, and then you build on it both through assemblage, but through painting, through photography, and how it can like circle back and feedback on itself. Some more detail shots, some other images, me on the left for scale, and then the final image on the right. Some other final images, some more close-ups. And then the color shifted too. Like there's always this exploration of just like, again, this thought of like, painting something not as it looks, but as it feels, was like a very freeing kind of like concept to really expand like what the visual language is around, landscape, and natural elements, which of course there's a long storied history of how those things are captured and represented. So I think that's been a huge part of what's enjoyable and kind of feels expansive about this body of work is there's just kind of this endless expanse there to play with. So some more detail shots here. But then also started doing like smaller, there's these larger versions that are kind of more like world building, but then there's these smaller compositions, the same way you would have, a macro close-up still life of a natural element, but then you can also have these like larger, vast kind of like landscape moments. So it's also fun to play with scale and how the, different levels can offer different things. One thing also worth noting, we've just seen these larger images at the top edge. I always left some white negative space, but then you also see the top very edge of the canvas. That was like my backdrop. And I loved leaving this in there in the final photograph because I feel like what it did is it was like leaving a little clue and an homage to the fact that this was like a painting, that you see like the canvas edge. So it's the fact that it, I just love that it has its one foot planted in that media. And so it's like leaving you behind that little clue. Some more close-ups, details. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, there's also like these smaller compositions that started being interesting in terms of, I really loved how like you can build a sense of like depth and kind of surreality through like bringing the actual objects, but then layering them in with like photographs of themselves. And so, you have the real shadows and then kind of like the shadows that are printed into the backdrop. And it's really kind of, things start to blur together in terms of like what I'm seeing, which part of it is real, which part of it is like a photograph being rephotographed, which part of it is like an actual natural element that was brought into the set, which is a nice kind of exploration that you get, especially at the smaller size where you can really just focus on these kind of like formal qualities. Which leads me to a project that I just finished just last week, called Negatives. This was part of the Glean residency here in Portland. If you're not familiar, Glean is a residency that's been around for almost 2 decades, whereby 5 artists get 5 months to make a body of work using only kind of reclaimed objects from the dump, essentially. So everything in the piece has to be something that you reclaimed. So what I started doing is kind of building these very similar process where I'd pull these elements, these left behind elements that just like were clearly discarded, thrown away, and started playing with this idea of like what's left behind, these leftovers, to create these new abstractions. But oftentimes like pulling pieces out of them, cutting pieces out and bringing pieces into other pieces. So you see maybe in the upper left-hand corner of this piece, you can see there's actually holes cut in the pieces where you're seeing like the actual background, the actual void, the actual like negative. And then I would take those pieces and build them into other pieces. So I love this idea that like in the same way that I'm taking these seeds from like this, discarded pile of trash to build new pieces, then I would take pieces of my own pieces and use them to build other things. And then also what I wanted to experiment too was just like a larger range of materiality and actually like making things that were no longer 2D things, but actually 3-dimensional objects that like are bringing in this broader range of materiality. So whereas before I would like take photographs and combine them with like assemblage, sculpture, painting, but then the end result would always be a photograph. In this case, the end result is actually this like larger piece that's, an assemblage that like kind of pushes more towards a sculptural object, starts to break a little bit away from just like purely rectilinear thing. Obviously, we're bringing in additional textures, elements, finding a whole new way of bringing depth, but also kind of opening the door for just like some playfulness and humor, especially with working with source material from the dump, which is, as you can imagine, gray, brown, smelly, muddy, kind of gross, very dirty. It was very interesting to find these little like hits of color, little containers of paint or toner or what have you, and like use those as seeds of just like optimism of, what can come to life. What kind of small fragments of growth or imagination can you pull from something that is kind of inherently very like sad and depressing, and think about it through a lens of like regeneration, which also kind of opened the door for a lot of these more, I mean, a lot of the elements you're seeing here are like elements from toys or things that are like related to childhood, which kind of happened organically at first. And then I think the more I started working with them, the more I realized is that, imagining something better out of something terrible or thrown away or discarded is a very kind of like youthful space to be in. Like imagination is like inherently, or not inherently, but oftentimes like tied to that like youthful state of just like, living in your mind of like, recontextualizing objects of like what they could be or their new potential. So I just kind of like left that door open for those, I would say like youthful components, toys, materials, bright plastics to kind of bring in some more of these. And again, I kind of really love that, there are photographs in these, there are paintings in these, but also these kind of sculptural elements all kind of melange together, creating this like, um, like very nuanced type of creation with like levels of depth. On the top edge of this piece is actually like a laser cut piece of wood. Looks like someone laser cut. I think it's the state of Pennsylvania there, unless my geography is terrible. But I kind of love those like pieces. They were this early kind of North Star for the whole series of just like, oh, there's these things that are left behind that are kind of beautiful in their own right. And so I love playing this idea of like the negative, the left behind. Again, another larger scale piece. And just finding new ways to like create a visual language, creating depth. Again, whereas before, the depth was created and then photographed, and then the end result being a 2D object. The end result here being this more kind of layered 3D object that's kind of blurring the lines between, a lot of different media. Then what I would do is a lot of like the cutouts and the left behinds of my own work, then I would start to create into these smaller sculptures. So I just love this idea of like recursive seeds, that like everything can be a seed for a new piece. So this was a thing I started doing like late in the practice, is I just like had a lot of scraps that would come out of making of like the larger pieces. So I started kind of reshaping these and reworking these into these small, roughly kind of 4 by 6 inch sculptures. So I'm just like a huge fan of like everything can be a seed for something new. Like there is no waste, the same way like a nurse tree in the woods falls down and it doesn't go to waste. It becomes like the birthing place for some new growth. That's kind of how I imagine these. Like even my own practice, its detritus can be generative for something else. That's my run of show. Maybe I'll pause there and see if there's any questions I can answer in the few minutes we have left.
If we're just if people can jump in, I'm really always interested in the indeterminate space of your work, like
Hmm.
um, like something I loved about the Glean exhibition is I just love how like standing in front of the work, you know, not being able to label it as like sculpture or painting or but it being all those things at once. It's not a it's not a sculpture. It's not a painting. You know what I mean? Like that, and I really like that. And I, as a musician and artist myself, I'm interested if you see a space for the music to kind of come back into that world?
That's a really good question. It's there was kind of a one-off exhibition I did earlier in this year where I was bringing video back into like, I mean, it's essentially a piece very similar to this, but it had like video screens in it. And it made me think about like how now when I'm doing visual art projects, like it's the last thing I think about. And I kind of am critical of that and wish that I was thinking about that kind of component. Like I have some shows coming up in this fall, and I'm very much thinking about like, well, how do I also like think about the audio experience and like how incomplete it feels kind of to not do that. Especially given like how much I do think about music. I think to me the question is like what form does that take? Is it through live performance? Is it through, a soundtrack that's always in the space? Is it through something that exists outside the space so you can listen to it even when you're not at the art show? Those are some things I'm still thinking about. But yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I struggle. I mean, I don't know if it's just because it's the difference, it's trying to reconcile visual art to an audio medium kind of a thing. 'Cause, but yeah, I find myself hitting that roadblock too, where it's like, I want to answer that question. Like, well, so how does, I get everything else involved. How do I get this other thing involved? And I can never find that space. So I don't know. Let us know when you figure it out.
Yeah. Right. And it's probably not anything that there's like a single answer. And I think the answer
Right.
will probably be like different for everyone and different for every context. And I think part of what I run into when I think about it is like the gallery context, at least like your typical like white cube gallery
Hmm.
is not always like really configured well for sound, in the same way that like a
Right.
performance venue could be. So there's kind of this degree of problem solving that has to be done. Like an example would be like, oh, if I want different sounds for different pieces, like how does that not all mash together in a way that is not intended, or those sorts of considerations. Or me personally, I don't like putting on headphones when I go into like a gallery space. So how do I work around those limitations? But I also like can see that like, oh, things sound great in headphones.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I think there's a lot of things to be explored there.
Totally.
As an aside, I also think that about smell too.
Yeah. Yeah.
As much as I'm like affected by smell, and I feel like it can be incredibly powerful in terms of like setting a context and creating an emotional, I don't know, tone.
Hmm.
That it's something that I've never really like thought of and or explored fully in terms of just like making an experience.
Yeah.
I have a question, but Stephanie, I see your, yeah. Do you have a question?
Sort of, yes. So I appreciate and actually hearing about the music elements. Now that I'm bringing it back, looking at this last piece, I can actually see that I'm very attracted to your bright colors, and saturation is very strong, and I those things all strike with me. And so I'm just wondering what your process is as far as like when you're having a bad day. Are you looking for, you've mentioned a couple of those pieces, particularly you want to paint how it makes you feel, is it, or feelings, right? And like that's what you're looking for, is what something feels like, not what it looks like. And so is that, do you have to get into that headspace, or what does that process look like? Is that something that you think about like when you're doing your reclamation? What,
Hmm.
working on those things, how does that kind of process question?
That's a good question. I feel like one of the things I've been paying a lot of attention to, and maybe this comes as no surprise, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, so like maybe the last two projects that you've seen here, um, is really, really tuning into like how the state I'm in when I'm creating. And oftentimes I'm asking myself the question, like, is there joy in this? And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be like dealing with the positive subject matter. So for example, like the Glean residency, you're dealing with something that's just like very, very depressing, like to be encountering when you're going to the dump and digging through things in this very dangerous, this very loud, this very smelly, this very depressing context. Um, it can be a downer, but I think in the act of creating, at least like in the work I've been doing, like I'm always the thread I'm pulling is often or kind of like an optimistic thread. It's like, what's the positivity that you can bring out of something that may not be positive? And to that end, this may sound like really kind of noodly, but like I have a very specific routine for when I get into the studio. I wear like the same types of clothing. I put on a certain smell. I listen to, I have this like very long, it's probably, I don't know, like a 30-hour playlist. That's the only thing I listen to, that has no words in it. And I do not control it at all. Like I intentionally put it on and it's on random and there's no interference with it. I mean, essentially all little pieces that just like create this very specific mind state that I want to get into, this specific way of working or specific state I want to be in when I'm working, putting phones away, all those sorts of things. Um, and I think for me, like if it's not feeling right, like the most important thing to me when I'm making is like how it's feeling when I'm making it. It's not really what the end result, because the end result's like only, for me, is like only really going to be a reflection of like where I was in the process. And so I think that kind of focus and that barometer of making sure it's coming from like a place of optimism and I don't know, hopefulness and joy, for lack of like a less cheesy term, I think has really been like a North Star and maybe, I mean, hopefully it comes through.
Oh, hey, Chris. Sorry we came in late, but I'm in here with the class. I can kind of show you. Say hi.
Oh,
Hi. Oh, I undid it. Did I break it? I broke something. Anyway, I have a question. You can hear me?
yeah, we
Yeah.
hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. I know that I've known your work for a long time, and I know that you've done so many things, and it's quite impressive. Especially, I early on, I knew you for your video stuff that you'd play also live with your performances and music. Wondered, we had some ideas of like, how do you use, maybe you use video and maybe use lighting. You're obviously professional of all these things in some of the assemblages, because sometimes, I mean, you have such like range of the way you can capture these, and we were kind of wondering, I'm like, do you ever like shoot a projection on it and see how those photos come out or anything like that pop up?
That's a really good question. I just started like thinking about like bringing video back into these, and did like a small group show. I guess it was at the end of last year, that was making some images that were seventies but had like video screens and that were embedded in it. So I've started to like think about that too, just because that's, I don't know, something I've always been drawn to. And obviously like video can be incredibly powerful component to these, and especially as like, I mean, I think the drum I'm beating over and over in the through line of so much of this work is like combining things together in ways that are just like confounding and unusual. So yeah, definitely starting to think about that, and also starting to think about like within the gallery so often, and this is like my own default, is like, okay, you make these pieces and then you bring them into a white space and then you blast them with like white light. Like end of sentence, like no other consideration. I went to a show recently at Carnation, which is a gallery I'm part of here in Portland. And the show was just like very mixed lighting. There was like gels over the lighting. There was like some of the lighting came through projections that were bouncing off of walls. So it's just like actually the light in the room, the ambient light was just like very dynamic. And what I realized being in that space was just like I liked being in that space so much more. And all the spaces that I'm in general have like a much more nuanced sense of lighting. Like not everything is getting blasted. So I'm actually really interested in, with future exhibitions, thinking about like, well, why does it have to just be blasted with white light all the time? Like, can there be a greater nuance or dynamism with like how the illumination is in the room? And does that make the space feel like a place that I frankly just want to be in more? Because in typical, like in general, um, like a blasted bright white space is not always like, for me, the space I want to like hang out in the most. Like I want something with like some natural light, some nuance, some fall off, some like dark areas, some shadowy areas. And I understand, of course, just like the tactical, I guess, utilitarian need of like people being able to see, which is of course a consideration. But at that like sound, like you had mentioned, Doug, was like another thing. I was like, why have I never thought about like different ways to approach like light? with how something is rendered.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that seems to align with your ethos of like wanting to get a positive or good feeling out of a work or a process. Because when we see like these works, and a lot of them, there's a lot of joy and fantastic nature to them, with blurring and color and just indeterminate spaces, which is just awesome, and I love that. So yeah, I hear you in saying like, oh yeah, the spaces are always so stark in a gallery. But
Yeah.
do you anticipate maybe having some interest in doing like I don't know, another kind of installation where you would really mess with that? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, my next show will be in September at this gallery called the Purple Door on Division Street in Portland. And that's one of the things I've already been thinking about, is just like how to make that space like just feel not like a gallery space. And feel more of like an experiential, and I know that word is like loaded in this context, or like just like these days, but like I don't know, a space that like you just want to spend more time into, that is just more friendly to you. It's just like a human creature. And I think sound goes into that, scent goes into that. Like, um, interestingly enough, like as an anecdote, I'm part of an artist friend gallery here in Portland. And so as part of that, like I gallery sit, so I'm like sitting in the gallery as people come. And what has been the most surprising, almost like shocking, is how many people think that they're not allowed or not supposed to be in the gallery. Like I, just being of an art context, assume that like, oh, anyone, like it's a place anyone could walk into. But what I've realized, and actually through talking to other gallerists, is like quite the opposite. Like there's just like a default sense of someone sees art gallery as a concept. It's like a place that's not welcoming, a place that you're not supposed to go into unless you have money, unless you're invited, unless you're a certain type of person. And I really don't like that. And so I think I'm also thinking about just like from, I don't know, like an inclusionary or populist point of view, like how can I make any of the spaces I'm involved in or any of my own shows feel like they're really for anyone and everyone. It's not just this certain audience. So yeah, a lot of those considerations.
I have a question that kind of goes along with both Stephanie's question and Damien's for that matter, is color. Your sense of color is wonderful. You're very confident. It strikes a certain mood and emotion. Do you have any, but but working with color is hard. It's really hard. Do you
Yeah.
have any recommendations for students just starting out, or actually all of me, all of us? Do you have any recommendations for choosing color palettes?
Yeah. I think the short version of it is make it something that's very, very intentional. And by that, I mean, and maybe even saw it in the context, like this whole presentation was chronological. If we went back through the lens of color, you can see early on, it's just kind of all over the board. And there, I think that was something that I've struggled with, and actually spent a lot of time where like I just tried to figure out like what's my palette. I literally did like studies where I'm like, what's my yellow? What's my green or greens? Like, what are the ones that like really, really resonate with me? And if you looked in my studio on the wall, like I have it up. Like there's certain like, oh, when I'm doing greens, I like this version of whatever that paint is in this style, and try to use those as my kind of cornerstones, so to speak. And things always like kind of merge and shift once you're actually like making, and I think that's fine. But like knowing that I'm always starting from like this set place that like I've put in the time and focus to actually like land first. And it was literally just like taking it was probably like an entire weekend where I just did like color studies of just like pulling up swatches, no, yes, like this one, don't like this one. And I worked between, for a while, I was working between watercolor and acrylic pens. And so like all the colors are different according to like the different types, of course, but then also different brands to figuring that out. And then on the flip side of that, since photography is such a part of my process, I was also doing the same kind of approach within photo editing tools of just like how I'm tweaking my color balances so that like, let's say I'm printing an image that has this red wash, it is like the same red that I'm using in the paints. So like in the same way that in my studio, I have like a painted swatch thing on the wall that is kind of my reminder. Like I have a digital version of it too, so that when I'm like photographing or treating images that are going to be printed and brought in, it's pulling from those same sorts of palettes. But it even gets into like when I'm printing, I'm like essentially cranking up the saturation on the printer as far as it will go to get the same saturation that I would get in paints, because toner operates very differently than like paint. And like especially photo printers are not going to like print things usually at the vibrance that you see in like the vibrance that you get naturally in paints. So you kind of have to artificially crank those things. Anecdotally, you'll burn through a lot more ink that way if you're printing a lot, because you always have those your saturations cranked.
That's good to know, because when I print, I'm like, how do I get them? I've been blowing out the saturation. I was like, I hope this isn't like a weird thing to do, but it gets it so much better. So I agree.
Totally, totally. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Do you want to plug your shows? You have 2 coming up, right? You want to
I have 2 coming up. Yeah. So the first Friday in September, I'm drawing a blank on the date, but at Purple Door in Portland, which is a gallery on Division, which is right across from the Tomorrow Theater, the Portland Art Museum Theater. And then in October, first Thursday, we'll be at Stumptown Downtown. But now on view is the Glean Show, a group show. It's myself and 4 other artists down in the Northwest Park blocks. If you're familiar with PNCA, it's just a couple blocks over from PNCA, kind of between PNCA and where the Blue Sky Gallery is. That'll be on view through May, as regular gallery hours, Saturdays and Sundays, through May 25th. And you can always find me all those information and details on my website or on the social. Oh yeah, Glean Portland. Thanks, Kendra.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks, Kendra. Thanks, Damien. Thanks, Clark team. So nice to chat with you. Yeah, and if anyone has questions after, I love emails, DMs, follow up. Love talking about this stuff. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, great to see you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm gonna